Just after 9 p.m. on the 3rd of August 1989, a Ford LTD station wagon plummeted into the Detroit River with the DeLisle family inside. While husband and wife Lawrence and Suzanne DeLisle survived the terrible accident, their 4 children who had also been in the car all tragically drowned under 30 feet of water. Lawrence claimed to the police that he had gotten a leg cramp which forced his foot down on the accelerator, which then had somehow gotten stuck. But later, after an intense and lengthy interrogation, he confessed to deliberately driving the car into the river with the intention of killing his family. Lawrence was found guilty of murdering his 4 children and has spent the last 30 years in jail. But is everything as it seems? Was this a case of a rundown father making the horrifying decision to rid himself of the family he had come to view as a burden? Or has a terrible injustice occurred, resulting in an innocent, grieving man being wrongfully convicted? Welcome to the tragic case of the DeLisle family. Hi, hello, how are you? How is your week going? Welcome back to my channel. If I haven't seen your face before, then hi, my name's Liz, and I quite often sit right here and talk about things like true crime and unresolved mysteries. So if you're into that kind of thing as well, then you should probably just hit subscribe and we can be best friends forever if you want and if you don't want, because we're best friends now. But enough about me. We, of course, have the real star of the show here as well, Lily Girl, to provide us emotional support and also just visual and audio distractions throughout the video. Editing this, let's switch to Lily Cam. You having a good day, Lily? All good? So I don't know why I keep doing this to us, choosing cases that involve the deaths of children. Like I've got no excuse. I don't know. The only thing I can think of is that these are the cases that keep me awake at night. And this case in particular, just a heads up, it's horrific. It's terrible. And I can see opinions on this case being very divided. I've gone back and forth so many times over the years, and I'm not going to share my current opinion until the very end of the video, because I want you guys to have the chance to form your own opinions. So with that all said, let's begin. So the DeLisle family was made up by 28-year-old Lawrence DeLisle, his wife, Suzanne DeLisle, who was 32, and their 4 children, Bryan, who was aged 8, Melissa, aged 4, Kathryn, who was 2, and Emily, who was just 8 months old. And they lived a pretty simple life. Lawrence, who we're going to call Larry from this point on because that's a name he goes by, he had lived in Michigan since he was about 2 years old. And when he met Suzanne just months before his 18th birthday, the two fell in love and were married soon thereafter. The family lived in a suburb called Lincoln Park, just outside of Detroit, and Larry worked as a service manager at a tire store where he specialized in front end and brakes, just as his father had before him. And there he earned a modest salary of about $31,000 a year, which is roughly $66,000 by today's standards. Thursday, the 3rd of August, 1989 had been a hot, sticky day, and Larry had sweated it out working a long 10-hour shift at the tire store. When he finished, he went and picked up his family in their 1977 Ford LTD station wagon, and they went out shopping for new beds for the girls. After shopping for beds, seeing as it had been such a warm day, Larry and Suzanne decided to treat the kids to frozen custard at a place called Bob Joe's. And Larry says everyone was in such a great mood. The kids were delighted having their frozen custard. And he said that Melissa asked him if they could drive down to the river and watch boats pass, which is something they had done the night before. Larry agreed, and the family hopped back into the station wagon and drove down a dead-end street called Eureka Road to the Detroit River, hoping that there would just be, one or two boats passing that could entertain the kids. But after a few minutes, with no luck, there were no boats. The family gave up and headed to the pharmacy to get some pain relief for baby Emily, who had recently started teething and was now starting to cry. This visit to the river had caught the attention of a woman named Beverly Lake. Beverly was on the balcony of her corner apartment on the 11th floor of Biddle House, which overlooked where Eureka Road finished and the Detroit River began. Beverly had also been on her balcony and seen the station wagon and the DeLisle family the night before when they had stopped to watch boats pass then. She would later testify in court that because Eureka Road was a dead-end street, she tended to recognize the vehicles that drove past. And the DeLisle family station wagon stood out because, number one, it was unfamiliar, and two, because for 2 nights now it had pulled up to the river, paused for a short while, and then turned around and left. It was 20 minutes later at about 9:20 p.m. that she saw the car for a third time, but this time she heard it as well, making a terrible roar as it raced towards the river. Beverly watched on in horror as the car did not slow down or brake once it reached the end of the street, instead crashing through the barricades and flying, airborne for a short moment before it crashed into the river. Once her shock had worn off, she quickly jumped to action and called 911. The car had been traveling approximately 45 miles or 70 k's an hour when it went airborne, so it flew about 50 to 70 feet before crashing into the choppy waters, where it was now very quickly sinking to the bottom of the river about 30 feet below. The windshield smashed upon impact, so Larry and Susan were luckily able to escape the car. Now, I'm not sure what Susan's swimming skills were like, but Larry has said that he can only tread water. So according to his own account of the accident and that of witness accounts, once he surfaced, he never attempted to go back under. Susan, on the other hand, went straight back under the water, coming up occasionally to scream hysterically for her babies. She testified later that she couldn't get the strap on Emily's safety seat undone, and it quickly got too dark in the murky waters to see the children in the back of the station wagon. Larry and Susan were rescued by passing boaters, and they watched on as just 6 minutes after Beverly Lake's 911 call, divers hit the water, desperate to save the children still trapped in the car. The children were brought up one by one, and all of them were unconscious and not breathing. They were rushed in ambulances to Wyandotte General Hospital, where the staff worked on them for hours, but sadly, none of the children regained consciousness, and they passed away in the opposite order to which they had been born. Wyandotte Police Detective Dan Gillespie was one of the first on the scene of the accident. He had helped with the efforts of pulling Bryan, Melissa, Kathryn, and Emily out of the water. And when he interviewed Larry on the 5th of August, just 2 days after the accident, it's safe to say he was already suspicious of Larry's story. Larry said that day he had been having trouble with his legs. He had had issues with his legs on and off since he was younger, and that day he was in so much pain that he had taken his shoes off while driving. Larry told Gillespie that when he pulled back out of the pharmacy that night just before the accident, his leg had cramped, and rather than turning left towards home, he had turned right back towards the river. It's a little bit confusing. He said that the leg cramp forced his left leg to cross over his right, and that his foot stomped down hard on the accelerator, and that the leg cramp was that strong that he had to use his hands to physically lift his leg off the gas pedal. But when he did this, the car didn't slow down. The accelerator did not ease up at all. Panicking, he reached down, thinking something must be stuck, his shoe maybe, and he repeated this to Gillespie several times. Something was stuck. And then Susan, next to him, who was panicking as well, started grabbing at the wheel, pulling it in the opposite direction to what he was pulling it in. And Larry says he was still fighting for control of the vehicle when they ran out of road and were suddenly flying airborne into the Detroit River. He told Gillespie that he didn't go back under for the children because he couldn't swim and he had a fear of deep water. But Gillespie, listening to this, was not buying Larry's version of events, and he was just instantly suspicious of this leg cramp story. And so was the media, who had been camping outside the DeLisle family home for days, harassing Larry and Suzanne for an interview about the tragic accident that had claimed the lives of their 4 children. It was day 5 after the accident that Larry and Suzanne finally caved and sat on their porch to talk to the press. But this just made things so much worse. We, of course, are familiar with the scenario where grief-stricken people who have just lost a loved one are scrutinized for how they act, for not acting the way that they should. And as a result, the media and the public cast them as suspicious or even guilty for not crying enough, for not acting devastated enough. And that's exactly what occurred here. Larry and Susan displayed little to no emotion during the interview, and Larry puts this down to them being private people who greeted everyone with a smile no matter what they were going through. He also says a family member gave him 2 Valium before they went outside and spoke to the press. So Larry was barely aware of his surroundings. He doesn't even remember the interview today. Just at one point, he looked up at a plane that was flying overhead. That's all he remembers. But in this interview, Larry told his convoluted story about his left leg crossing over his right and maybe his shoe getting stuck. And now it wasn't just the police and the media that was skeptical, but also the public. Now, a couple of days after the initial interview that Detective Gillespie had with Larry, where Larry said that he thought his shoe must have gotten stuck on the gas pedal somehow, Larry changed his story and he told Gillespie that he believed that the accelerator itself had gotten stuck. Changing his story, of course, just raised more suspicion, and this idea of the accelerator getting stuck, of course, sounds crazy, but as it turns out, it's not that crazy. Just hear me out. So after the very heavily televised event of the car being lifted out of the Detroit River by a crane, it was inspected by a mechanic named Jim Colquell. And Colquell found several faults with the car, one of which being a kink in the accelerator cable, which would cause the cable to stick. The throttle plates could also be heard scraping inside the carburetor, and the engine mount was broken, which would allow the engine to tilt and tug on the accelerator cable. And any of these faults, which were all common in that make and model vehicle, had the potential to cause rapid and uncontrolled acceleration. Ford had actually had to recall this engine for that reason, but only in the pickup trucks and not in the station wagons. Interestingly, Ford actually had a very similar issue more recently in 2013 when they were sued for allegedly having knowledge about a defect in over 30 of their models that could potentially cause unintended acceleration, but hiding this knowledge from their customers for years. So Larry's story about the accelerator sticking is not as crazy as it sounds. Back to Larry's LTD station wagon, the car itself had a bit of a macabre history because Larry's father had committed suicide in the car 18 months earlier. There were still bloodstains from the shooting inside the car itself. And of course, a lot of people have been like, why? Why on earth did Larry keep this car? And Larry recently had the chance to explain himself in the Wrongful Conviction podcast with Jason Flom. And he said that after his father had committed suicide, his father's wife had wanted to give him something because both Larry and his sister had signed away their rights to the house so that she wouldn't have to move out or refinance or anything like that. So she gave Larry the car, and Larry said said that, of course, at first, absolutely, he did not want this car, but his father had driven him around in station wagons all the time as a kid. And when he drove it for the first time, he just felt at peace. It felt right. Larry and Susan had also already been planning on downsizing from their more expensive car to help with bills, so it just worked out. Back to the investigation. After Larry claimed that the accelerator had stuck, police tested the car by creating a 396-foot course, which was the same distance that the car had traveled that night, and basically flooring it and then slamming on the brakes at the end of the course over and over. And I hope you guys are ready for a plot twist, because on the 21st test, the accelerator actually stuck. The engine just roared out of control until they finally pulled the keys out of the ignition. I mean, it's just crazy. Like, you couldn't write that. And they just tested it one more time. The accelerator didn't stick, and that was the end of the testing. On the 10th of August, 1 week after the accident, Larry and Susan both agreed to polygraph tests. So in separate police cars at about 7:30 a.m., they were taken to a Michigan State Police facility. Detective Gillespie, who was pretty much certain that Larry had intentionally driven his family into the river that night, reached out to a police psychologist to ask him, what's the best way to interrogate this guy to get him to confess? And the psychologist referred him to a man named John Palmatier. And Palmatier is a pretty interesting guy. At the time, he had a bachelor's degree in psychology and criminal justice. He was also into Zen Buddhism and martial arts, and had been contacted in this case because of his ability to pull confessions like rabbits out of hats. The polygraph exam was videotaped and began at 10 a.m. with Palmatier telling Larry, how incredibly accurate this lie detector test was. Something we know to just be an outright lie. And he was telling Larry, how he didn't know why, but he had been given this gift to look much deeper into people than anyone had ever thought possible. So basically, setting up the scenario where both the test and Palmatier are infallible. And he asks Larry some questions and then leaves the room for a couple of minutes, and then comes back shaking his head, telling Larry he's failed the test. And it all went downhill from there. At the beginning of the questioning, Larry said that the idea of him driving the station wagon intentionally into the river that night was just ludicrous, that he loved his family more than anything and he would never have intentionally hurt them. And Palmatier came alongside him, at least it would have seemed that way to Larry, telling Larry he believed him and that Larry was more of a victim than his own children. But Palmatier also very quickly started dropping ideas into Larry's head, like that he didn't have good role models for how to handle things when they got too much, like his father. Or like maybe Larry had initially just stomped on the accelerator to scare Suzanne and then decided he didn't want to stop. Or that maybe Larry was controlled by this demon inside him and that's why he had driven into the river and it wasn't really his fault. At one particularly disturbing part of the interrogation, Palmatier brings up that baby Emily had been crying, and he says to Larry that he himself, Palmatier that is, once threatened his own daughter that if she didn't stop crying, he was going to tie her up in a garbage bag, throw her in the closet and leave her there for a while. So he was pulling out all the stops. Larry sat through over 7 hours of interrogation techniques like this, and you can see quite a few clips of the interrogation in the Netflix documentary, The Confession Tapes. And quite frankly, it's difficult to watch. And although in the confession tapes, Palmatier swears he doesn't hypnotize the people that he's questioning, watching the tapes, you can feel from his tone that there's just something going on under the surface. And Larry just sinks lower and lower in his chair, almost like he's melting under this immense pressure. You feel like you're watching a nervous breakdown in progress. And Palmatier eventually gets what he wants out of Larry. Larry makes incriminating statements, and not just about the accident. He also talks about a time 8 years earlier where he attempted to blow up the house while Suzanne, his wife, and their infant son Bryan were sleeping by leaving a burning candle by a leaky gas clothes dryer in the basement. This interrogation ended at about 5:30 p.m., but Larry's day did not end there. He was then taken to Wyandotte Police Station where he was interrogated again, this time by Detective Gillespie, and this interrogation ran from about 10:45 p.m. to 1 a.m. in the morning. So this was an 18-hour day for Larry, which ended in him being arrested. The very next day, Larry was arraigned on 4 counts of first-degree murder for his children and 1 count of attempted murder for his wife, Suzanne. And at this arraignment, Detective Gillespie, the police chief, and the mayor all announced to the press that Larry had confessed to everything and that his premeditation had gone back some time. But when the presiding judge, Roberto Colombo Jr., viewed the tapes of Larry's so-called confession in December before his trial, he ruled the tapes to be inadmissible in court, saying that Larry's statements had been very clearly coerced and involuntary, and therefore unreliable. But the press, who had already run absolutely rampant with this story and were aware of the confession, demanded access to the tapes, even though they had been ruled inadmissible in court. Judge Colombo was like, no, because it made exactly 0 sense to, on one hand, say that the statements were not allowed in court because they were involuntary and invalid, but then on the other hand be like, yeah, let everyone in the world know about the statements, including the people that would one day be on the jury deciding if Larry was guilty or not. But after a bit of back and forth in a bizarre and unprecedented ruling, Judge Colombo was overruled by the Recorder's Court. And what's super frustrating is that the judge at the Recorder's Court that continually argued for the tape's release never even bothered watching them. So in January 1990, it was decided that rather than just giving the press these tapes and letting them broadcast them for all to see, it would be a better idea to invite members of the press to the Michigan Court of Appeals and show them the tapes and let them write their own transcripts so that they could report on Larry's statements that way. And as a result, lengthy transcripts of the interrogation were published in Detroit newspapers for the public to read. To be honest, it probably would have been better if they had just let the press broadcast the tapes, because then at least the public would have been able to see and hear that Larry's statements were coerced. Reading the transcripts in a newspaper, it's like reading an email. You can't pick up on the tone or the expression or the emotion. That's why emojis are a thing. And I don't think the newspapers were using emojis. And of course, when the newspapers reported that Larry's confession couldn't be used in court against him, a lot of them didn't specify that this was because the statements were made under duress, and this left the public to fill in the blanks. A lot of the public just assumed Larry had realized he'd gotten himself into trouble and withdrawn his confession, but the confession had to be legit, or the Michigan courts would have never ruled for its release to the press. Right? So in this trial by media, Larry had already been found guilty before his actual trial had ever begun. Skipping forward to June 1990, the jury selection process involved the potential jurors filling out a lengthy questionnaire and being questioned separately instead of in a group setting. And this was to make sure that they weren't biased against Larry, which was pretty much impossible at this point. The defense requested a bench trial instead of a jury trial, and they were denied. They also requested a change of venue 3 times and were denied 3 times because Judge Colombo argued that some time had passed since the accident and the press coverage had pretty much ended in January, which was 5 months earlier, and he felt that there was no evidence of a strong community feeling or bitter prejudice against Larry, which would be a flawed argument even if it were true, which it wasn't. The press coverage of the case didn't finish in January because within a month of the trial commencing, the Michigan Court of Appeals publicly reaffirmed Judge Colombo's suppression of Larry's statements, prompting local news stations and newspapers to put out stories detailing the confession again. A series of articles came out just 1 week before jury selection began. In fact, some members from the jury pool were interviewed by the press and said just based on the confession, they felt Larry was guilty. And the media's intense attention to the case was the reason they built this glass booth at the back of the courtroom to house them while they covered the trial. So the jury was selected. All of them had heard about the case previously. All but one of them regularly read Detroit newspapers, and 5 of them admitted to knowing about the suppressed statements that Larry had made, but said that they could put this knowledge aside and base their decision solely on the evidence presented in court. Frank Eman, Larry's defense lawyer, told the jury in his opening statements that what had happened on the 3rd of August 1989 was so obviously an accident that they were going to wonder why they were there. The prosecutor, Kevin Samowski, however, argued that Larry, weighed down by $13,000 or roughly $27,000 by today's standard in bills and loan debt and just the burden of having a family, had intentionally driven into the river that night, intending on dying along with his family. The trial went for 8 days and over 24 witnesses were called in that time, including Larry's wife, Suzanne, who testified in his defense, saying that the accident was exactly that, a terrible accident. There were a couple of damning witness statements as well, including that of one Aaron Stonebrunner, one of the boaters who had rescued Larry and Suzanne that night. Stonebrunner told the court that while Suzanne had been hysterically crying and desperately diving back under the water to try and save the children, like I said earlier, Larry never once went back under once he had surfaced. He also said that once Larry and Suzanne were safely on the boat, he had overheard Larry say things like, "Oh my God, what have I done?" Beverly Lake, the woman that had had the bird's eye view of the accident, was of course a key witness for the prosecution, saying that the car had been there 2 times before the accident itself. And it was suggested that these occasions were test runs conducted by Larry before he finally worked up the nerve to drive his family into the river. Irving Rosian, who was an engineer and an expert in accident reconstruction, pointed out that there were no skid marks at the scene and that the car had driven in a very straight line towards the river. He also suggested that an indentation in the front left wheel suggested that when the car hit the curb that made the indentation, the driver was aiming to drive directly between 2 of the wooden barricade posts. So there were definitely some very incriminating testimonies for the prosecution. However, Larry's defense team managed to find about 100 cases of people reporting the same issue of the accelerator sticking in similar make and model vehicles, which is just insane. And the trial did seem to be swinging in Larry's favor. But on the 21st of June 1990, after deliberating for 9 hours over 2.5 days, the jury came back and found Larry guilty on all counts. And at the sentencing, Judge Colombo made some pretty troubling statements, suggesting that he would have preferred Larry being found guilty of a lesser charge like second-degree murder, negligent homicide, or even involuntary manslaughter. He said that he wasn't sure if Larry was guilty of what he had been charged with, not that he thought Larry was innocent, just that he wasn't sure that he was guilty. He also called into question his earlier ruling against a venue change in such a highly publicized case, saying maybe the jury had been subconsciously influenced by what they had already heard and seen in the media. Like you don't say. But given the severity of the conviction, he sentenced Larry to 5 life sentences to be served concurrently, meaning he's serving them all at the same time. And that's where Larry's been for the last 30 years, in jail. He, of course, appealed the conviction, saying that there had been multiple due process violations that occurred during the trial, that there was insufficient evidence to prove premeditation or intention to kill, and that his requests for a bench trial or a venue change should have been approved because members of the jury had clearly been biased against him. His appeal made it all the way to the Supreme Court, who refused to hear it. And that's it. Larry's appeals have all been exhausted. After Suzanne loyally stuck by Larry's side throughout the accident and the trial and a few years following, Larry and Suzanne got divorced in 1995. Larry says he himself suggested the divorce after he saw how much it hurt Suzanne to come and visit him in jail. Like Larry, Suzanne had been well and truly demonized by the media simply for backing him up. The majority of the public were just so certain of Larry's guilt that when she maintained his innocence, the only explanation they could come up with was that she must be in on it as well. She couldn't get a job because potential employers would recognize her name. She was getting threatening phone calls to the house, so eventually she was left with no real option but to move out of Lincoln Park, and friends and family eventually lost contact with her. Larry has recently survived COVID-19. There is a petition for his release on change.org, and he's also submitted a permission for clemency to be decided by Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And that is where this case stands as of today. So now we're going to get into final thoughts. I mean, what a doozy of a case. Like, I did warn you it was going to be tragic. Like I said, I've gone back and forth so many times. I'm not really going to address any of the statements Larry made during his confession because I totally agree that they were coerced and that he was very potentially hypnotized by John Palmatier. I guess it's fairly obvious at this point that at the very least, I do not think Larry got a fair trial. Like, the fact that those tapes were played for the media just blows my mind. The fact that the Michigan courts honestly thought that those tapes wouldn't affect the opinions of the people that eventually made the jury making the decision on Larry's fate. It doesn't make sense to me. And I feel like just based on that, his request for a venue change should have been approved 100%. It also blows my mind that the Supreme Court chose not to hear Larry's appeal. Like, I think there's plenty of evidence that he didn't get a fair trial, at least enough to validate hearing the argument and deliberating from there. Trial aside, as to whether Larry is guilty or innocent, I just don't know. Like, I change my mind every day when I was researching this case. And I guess I might say something else if you ask me tomorrow, but today I'm undecided. But if I had to, I would lean towards him being innocent. The main thing that got to me originally was that it seemed like Larry kept changing his story. I mean, first there was the leg cramp, then there's the shoe stuck on the gas pedal, then there's the accelerator sticking. But it kind of makes sense to me now. I mean, it was a hot day. Larry had worked a long shift. He was potentially dehydrated. It's well known that dehydration causes muscle cramps, so it's a bit of a stretch of the imagination, but it's not completely unreasonable to consider the idea that a leg cramp forced his foot down on the accelerator. The shoe thing threw me off. I mean, Larry wasn't sure if it was his shoe or not. He just knew that something was getting stuck. But I feel like what gets forgotten a lot is that assuming the accelerator did stick, Larry didn't know that at the time. Larry didn't know that the car was faulty, or he wouldn't have been driving it. All he knew was that the car wasn't stopping. And I feel like this is where the shoe story came from, his mind trying to fill in the blanks. And rather than immediately thinking, oh my God, there's something wrong with the car, he naturally came to the conclusion that his shoe had gotten stuck on the gas pedal. Like, this makes sense to me. I can get on board. But the next question is, why didn't he do something? Why didn't he steer the car away? Why didn't he put it into neutral? Why didn't he pull the keys out of the ignition? Just do something. But this I can pretty happily get past as well. Like, I think it's very easy for us sitting in our peaceful, quiet lounge rooms or, wherever you're watching this from and be like, why didn't he do this? Why didn't he do that? Why didn't he know exactly what was happening? But the whole event from when he pulled out of the pharmacy to when they crashed into the river took 7 to 10 seconds between the panic of a leg cramp and the car not slowing down, and then Suzanne grabbing the wheel, not to mention a crying, teething baby in the car. I can fully accept that 10 seconds might not have been enough time to work out what was wrong and how to react before they hit the river. There are things that I can't get past though, and one of them is that Larry never went back under to try and save the children. Like, okay, he couldn't swim and could only tread water, but he was also the father of those beautiful children and they needed him. But maybe I'm not being fair. I mean, I am fortunate enough to know how to swim, so I know without a doubt if it was my child, you would have to drag me kicking and screaming out of that river if he was still down there. There's just no doubt. There's no question. I just can't wrap my mind around Larry's instinct for survival overruling his instinct to save his babies. Another thing, if Larry did in fact have a leg cramp so strong that it forced his foot down on the gas pedal and he couldn't swim, how was he even able to surface, and quickly too, according to witness reports? Or the car going almost perfectly between two wooden barricade posts, like Larry had been aiming to drive between them. How did that happen if it wasn't intentional? I do think it's extremely difficult to have a strong, unwavering opinion in this case. Like, every time I think, yeah, 100% he was guilty or 100% he was innocent, I remember a detail and I'm like, oh, wait, that's right. And I have to reassess everything again. If you're interested, I will leave a link down below to the petition for Larry's release. But apart from that, that is today's case. If I didn't touch on anything or you'd like to add anything, please feel free to leave a comment down below. Lily, you want to come say bye? You want to say bye? What did you think? Do you think he's guilty or innocent? Let me guess. You're hungry. This is all she keeps me around for. Okay, but can I say bye as well? Okay, guys, thank you so much for tuning in and spending time with me. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you have the best week of all time, and I will see you next time. Bye.